I think we're going to get started. Welcome to our discussion on diversity, equity, and inclusion, specifically speaking about racial equity. Buckle up and hold on tight because we have some phenomenal speakers with us. But I want to briefly introduce myself. Good morning again. My name is Shamar Heron. I'm the Executive Director of Michigan Works Southeast. So all of my MWSE family out there, keep doing the great work. And to those who are not a part of the MWSE team, we welcome you and say thank you for joining us. We want to welcome you to today's panel discussion regarding diversity, equity, and inclusion, focusing on racial equity. This panel discussion is being recorded and made available for those who were not able to attend today. Before we begin our discussion, I would like to introduce our panel members. So up first, we have Asandi Connor. She is a voice bearer, strategist, writer, coach, and designer of beautiful spaces. In October 2020, she became the new director of the Detroit Equity Action Lab, an initiative of Wayne State University Law School's Damon J. Keith Center for Civil Rights. Asandi is also the founder and CEO of Say It Right, that is WRITE. So CEO of Say It Right, and a consultancy that helps organizations, professionals, and entrepreneurs communicate their social mission and articulate their authentic voice. For over 20 years, Connor has worked for and participated with many nonprofits. Before joining the Detroit Equity Action Lab, she led the Detroit Revitalization Fellows, a talent and leadership development program of Wayne State University's Office of Economic Development. As the DRF's director, she collaborated with diverse stakeholders to build a network of doers focused on Detroit's revitalization. Asandi has built a reputation as an interpersonal relations expert, creative problem solver, inclusive leader, and coach. She has 2 degrees and, more importantly, a multitude of career lessons that have shaped her leadership journey. She is a Detroiter and loyal Detroit Lions fan. She serves on 3 boards and enjoys watching Law and Order and SVU marathons, eating chocolate chip cookies, and dancing to house music. Asandi, welcome. Next, we have, congratulations on the new role as well. Next, we have Alfredo Hernandez. He is the equity officer for the Michigan Department of Civil Rights. Alfredo was born and raised in Panama. He moved to the United States in 1990 after graduating from high school and joined the U.S. Army at the age of 20. He has worked in the field of equity for many years, developing inclusive strategies for organizational change, as well as teaching college courses in philosophy of religion and cultural anthropology. Alfredo, thank you so much for joining us. We're looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you for having me.
Next, we have Rochelle Riley. She ended a nearly 20-year career as a national syndicated award-winning Detroit columnist in 2019 to become the City of Detroit's Director of Arts and Culture. In that role, she guides the city's investments in art and creates opportunities for transformative innovation. Her most recent project was the nation's first citywide memorial to victims of COVID-19. 15 funeral processions that circled the city's Belle Isle passed 907 photo billboards of victims. The author, essayist, and arts advocate travels the country hosting conversations about the burden that America still bears by refusing to deal with the aftermath of American enslavement. She was appointed to co-chair Governor Gretchen Whitmer's Black Leadership Advisory Council. She makes frequent television and radio appearances, including on the National Public Radio, WDIV-TV Channel 4, and Let It Rip with Hugh Perkins on Fox 2 Detroit. She previously worked at the Louisville Courier-Journal, the Dallas Morning News, and the Washington Post. She received the 2017 Ida B. Wells Award from the National Association of Black Journalists for her outstanding efforts to make newsrooms and news coverage more accurately reflect the diversity of communities they serve, and the 2018 Lifetime Achievement Award from the Society of Professional Journalists. Rochelle, we are so excited to hear from you. Congratulations on your esteemed awards.
Thank you very much. Honored to be here.
And lastly, but certainly not least, Mr. Robert Womack is a Kent County Commissioner where he serves on the Finance and Physical Resources Committee. He is also the General Manager and Program Director for WYGR 94.98 FM, a community empowerment radio incorporated. Welcome, Robert. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, Shamar. I'm proud to be here today.
We're proud to have you. Thank you. Today's discussion is part of a diversity, equity, and inclusion series that will take place throughout this year, 2021. We hope to bring you an informative and spirited discussion today about racial equity. Let's start today's discussion with a couple of questions for Alfredo Hernandez, Equity Officer for the Michigan Department of Civil Rights. So, Alfredo, we hear the words racial equity used a lot more these days. Why do you believe this has become such a hot topic of discussion?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And again, thank you for inviting me to this distinguished panel and this important conversation. In terms of racial equity and why perhaps it's something that we hear more, I think that maybe what we need to consider is that for some time now, we have been talking about equity and equality. And the conversation and the ways in which we talk about equity and equality has evolved, has changed, and we have seen tremendous change in terms of our willingness to embrace the conversation about race. The fact is that historically and culturally, we recognize that in the past, many things have taken place that have been wrong, and collectively we can acknowledge that. At the same time, sometimes when we look at progress, we may somehow, some way lose track of the amount of work that needs to continue to take place. I believe that we have been much more comfortable talking about disadvantages at a systems level in relation to gender and in relation to class, in relation to perhaps sexual orientation. And I'm not saying that we have been tremendously comfortable, but perhaps we have been a little bit more comfortable with conversations about systemic disadvantage, as long as we're not really talking a whole lot about race. But now when we think about the power of social media, all the different things that we're able to see now on TV, people with cameras and cell phones, and all the access that we have to information, it's become almost nearly impossible to hide the need to have conversations about race. So one of the things that maybe I like to just briefly highlight for the group here is that when we talk about racial equity, often we make the mistake to assume that it is just about race. And one of the things that we need to recognize is that the racial equity lens focuses on race extensively, but not exclusively. And it does it because it recognizes that it is an important part of the conversation that often has been left out of a conversation about equity. Race has been a principal force in building, sustaining, and shifting social political structures in our past and present. It continues to play a significant role in our decision-making process, in our personal, professional, and social lives, where we live, where our children go to school, who our friends are. A lot of it is, combination of explicit and implicit associations and understanding of ourselves and others. Yet our understanding of race continues to be incomplete. And part of the importance of recognizing that race, it's an important part of the conversation, and that the conversation about race, as it becomes more and more difficult to contain because of all the information that's coming to us as far as racial disparities and more, is that when we start with race, we often start at the bottom of social disparity. So a conversation about race and racial equity strategies often lead to building equity for all. In terms of exactly why we're talking more about race, I believe is primarily because it's become more and more difficult to put away and to hide the reality that people of color, people based on race and ethnicity, as we look at the data, are continuing to experience systemic disparities across our nation.
Wow. Very well stated. Thank you so much, Alfredo. I want to make a slight shift. We're still going to be in the particular vein of race, but we're going to shift towards racism. And so can you talk about the 4 dimensions of racism? And so for some of our listeners and the attendees, I'll give you those 4 dimensions of racism: institutional, structural, interpersonal, and internalized. And so, Alfredo, do you mind touching on the differences between the 4 and the impact of each?
Sure. So as we know, in the field of research of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and as the work continues to evolve, as we continue to understand the need to increase our racial consciousness and cultural competency, as we continue to understand that independently of how many PhDs we may collect or how educated we may be, that those degrees do not necessarily increase our racial consciousness and cultural competency. That this work requires a level of expertise that guides the work of implementation, that operationalizes equity, but also that helps us unlearn the many things that we need to unlearn in order to learn new things and make new associations that help us experience our experiences differently and outside from the ways in which they have been prescribed to us by history and culture, dominant history and culture. So when we think about the stages of a system of advantage based on race, as you mentioned, we have the internalized dimension. As human beings, we're not born on an island in isolation, grow up, and then decide to join society with our own values and principles, and then step into that society. No, we're born into society and we're taught how to understand and perceive what is right, what is wrong, who is us, who is them. All of that begins from very early on. And we begin to make those associations as to how we're going to interact with people and how we're going to make friends. And all of that begins to shape many times in unconscious ways how we step into and interact with the interpersonal space. Because again, we don't live in isolation on an island by ourselves and then join others. So in that interpersonal space, we begin to form us and them based on the most trivial categories, but also on messages that we have internalized, polarized messages that shape us in ways that we never meant to be shaped, that we never asked to be shaped as, but it's all happening unconsciously for the most part. And we begin to interact with others who we see as safe, who we see as similar, who we share things in common. One of the things that we need to remember here is that we're experts at minimizing difference and embracing similarities. And that doesn't come from nowhere. And definitely we don't have the time to go over all of that. But the fact is, when we embrace commonality, that's not a bad thing, but it is a very limited approach to our lived experiences in the world, because our capacity to be experts at thriving in difference, acknowledging difference, and embracing the innovation, creativity that and broader perspectives that come with it, it's something that we have not actually gotten enough experience on. So we embrace this notion of we're all the same, we're all human beings, and we look for ways to minimize the fact that there's tons of difference that needs to be acknowledged and talked about. So embracing commonalities is something that happens for the most part in that interpersonal space that's taking place today. But as we move into the institutions are not created by something other than people. And people from the interpersonal space with the mindsets, the cultural mindsets that they bring into the institutions begin to shape the institutional space. And we know that historically and culturally, institutions have been guilty for sustaining and creating exclusive outcomes. The structural space is nothing more than a collection of institutions that begin to collaborate with one another and create disparities that we see. So for example, if you think of an education system and where we live, we know we live residentially segregated, racially isolated, all those things are happening simultaneously. When we take into equation property taxes and the education system and schools and where they're located and who gets to go here, et cetera, all of that begins to create a system of advantage and disadvantage that is embedded in historical and cultural practices that for the most part have been oppressive and for the most part need to be revised to ensure that we're implementing an equity lens so that we're able to increase equitable access and opportunities for all.
Wow. Embracing commonalities, but appreciating differences. That is something that I can hold as a value myself. And I'm hoping that folks picked up on that because that is a really important piece. Our next question and final question directed towards you, Mr. Hernandez, is I know the Michigan Department of Civil Rights is committed to advancing racial equity in all of its initiatives. I understand the department has a racial equity toolkit that organizations looking to advance racial equity in order to ensure equal opportunity and access for all can use as a starting point. Can you tell us more about this toolkit and how organizations can access it?
Yeah, the toolkit is something that was created in collaboration with the School of Law and Policy at the University of Michigan. It is a toolkit that is basically meant to serve as foundational is meant to serve to provide a foundation for organizations to understand how to get started in this work. A lot of the common mistakes that we make collectively is that we step into this work, if we even step into it at all, with the assumption that we're all good people and that, for the most part, we don't need to do a lot of this work because as long as we rely on the fact that we're all good people, things are going to turn out okay. Well, they don't. There's plenty of research that shows that. And there are plenty of unintended outcomes, unintended consequences. So the purpose of the tool is to minimize unintended outcomes, to minimize unintended consequences, to help folks understand the impact of implicit bias. What is implicit bias? How does it impact you, the work you do, the people you serve? Are you able to recognize that you have those biases? And if you do, then what would you do with questions such as, okay, please mention a sexist or racist bias you have internalized. Please tell us how it has impacted you. And please tell us strategies that you have used to mitigate those biases. For the most part, folks struggle or don't know how to answer those questions, which simply point to the fact that we're not doing the work of introspection and reflection that needs to take place to address specifically the work of debiasing the self and our institutions. So the tools it's meant to help folks understand implicit bias and its impact, but it's also meant to provide a step-by-step guideline in terms of how to have conversations about race, mistakes that we may not want to make in the process, and provides tons of resources that are, rooted in national level expertise to help folks get started. A lot of times it's very difficult to get started and to understand how to do this. But I think less and less folks are minimizing the expertise that is required to do DEI. And we could see that at the state level. Now we have equity officers in every state agency, including the executive office that is currently working with all equity officers across the state to develop consistency and strategies that transcend compliance and engage in the work of prevention through education. So the toolkit hopes to serve as a platform for organizations to get started in this complex work. And please just go to our website and just check it out. Michigan Department of Civil Rights. You'll see it right on the front page. And if you have any questions, just reach out to me or anyone in the department. You should be able to see. Do the folks get our emails?
I'm not sure, but we did put the link to the toolkit in the chat. So
Okay.
There is an opportunity for folks to click on that link under the Racial Equity Toolkit that was added to the chat. It is there for you to take a look at. It'll take you directly to the toolkit. Alfredo, if you are interested in putting your email in the chat, you can. We can get with the association staff and find out how we disseminate contact information post this panel. So I want to thank you for sharing your words of wisdom. A lot to unpack there, but I think this is the time for us to start having these conversations and get comfortable being uncomfortable. Next, I would like to talk with Asandi Connor, director of the Detroit Equity Action Lab at Wayne State University, my dad's alma mater, so go Warriors. So I have a question for you, Asandi. You ready?
Yes.
Actually, I have several. So the Detroit Equity Action Lab promotes racial equity and justice by bringing together a multiracial, intergenerational group of leaders and innovators working in the many dimensions of racial equity to address issues of structural racism in the greater Detroit area. Now that was a sentence right there. I am excited to learn more, and I believe others are as well, about the Detroit Equity Action Lab. So can you please give us a little history of how it started and what you are trying to achieve as the director?
Yes. You already acknowledged that we are a program of Wayne State's Law School, and more specifically, the Damon J. Keefe Center for Civil Rights. And for those who do not know or are not familiar with Judge Keefe, he was the U.S. Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals judge, and he presided in Detroit. And so he also was an alumni of Wayne State's Law School. So that is the relationship that Judge Keefe had with the university. And there actually is a physical space, a center that chronicles the civil rights movement, but also the legacy building work that Judge Keefe did over his lifetime. And so while there's this physical space, what there was not in place is sort of an activation of this legacy. So an action or how to really continue the work into actual physical action and doing something. So that's where the Detroit Equity Action Lab, which is more affectionately known as DEAL, came into being. Thank you for sharing the links in the chat. And really our core foundational program is a racial equity fellowship program that began in 2014 is when we launched our first cohort. So while there have been more recent conversations, particularly over the past year, about race and racial equity, DEAL is not new to the space. We have been engaged for this work for nearly a decade at this point. And so before I even go further, I want to kind of provide some context for how we view racial equity and how we sort of look at it. And for us, it requires that we acknowledge the harm of structural racism and white supremacy. Like for us, that is first and foremost. And in addition to that, it demands that Black, Indigenous, and people of color have access and are equipped with tools and resources that they need to overcome racist barriers. So that is very important to sort of situate the work that we do. We don't view racial equity necessarily as a goal, but it is both an outcome and a process for us, and that it is also a pathway to social justice. To talk a little bit more just about what we're hoping to achieve and what we strive to do, it really is for us about developing those leaders, as you talked about, Shamar, to end structural racism. We are a hub or a lab, Detroit Equity Action Lab, that does community-driven research, but also programming that includes in the past some public programming prior to COVID, and also media work that is working again, to dismantle racist systems. We do this work via a framework that is based on knowledge, narrative, and network, which you can also learn more about on our website. And through the fellowship program, as well as our race and justice reporting initiative, collaborative projects, and leveraging the expertise of our alumni, we get to tell the stories about racial equity.
Wonderful, wonderful. And so as a leader, I'm sure you have just a broad set of conversations that you get to have every day, but the work is so intriguing, and I'm excited to see what comes out of this work that is ongoing, right? I don't think there's an endpoint to this. It's going to be continual. So my next question is, I know you have conducted several cohorts of the Detroit Equity Action Lab. Please tell us about the work the individual in these cohorts do and why it is so important. So you spoke a little bit to it earlier, but now maybe if you can talk to the work that the individuals within those cohorts do, we'd appreciate it.
Happily. So in December, we just completed our 5th cohort. So we now have over 140 fellows that represent more than 120 organizations across Detroit and the region. I'll highlight just really quickly a few of the fellows and the work that they're doing, just to give you an idea of the depth of the work and the projects and the movements that are happening. So we have a fellow, Deal 2 fellow, Tawana Petty, who works in the digital and data justice space. And she has been challenging our perceptions of surveillance as safety, as well as the uses of data science to create change primarily for Black lives. Another fellow was in our 4th cohort. Her name is Sadie Sarr, and she is really ensuring that Black and African immigrant populations are informed about their rights, that they have access to resources, and that they are also socially invested and civically engaged. Another fellow from our 2nd cohort is leading disability rights work, and she's helping to build the political power of the disability community. She is working not just with the disability community, but also at the intersection of including racial equity in their work and advocacy. And then finally, I'll just share about a fellow that just wrapped up her work wrapped up her fellowship with Deal 5 in December. Jeannie Winters is working in the education space and ensuring that we know how important education and miseducation is to perpetuating harm. And so she is, in her capacity with Wayne County Schools and Wayne RISA, ensuring that thread of equity and racial equity is a part of the education system there. And so just from that brief sample, you can see that we have this really dynamic cross-section of folks that work in not only just the nonprofit space, but we also have folks, including an alum from state government, and as well as community leaders and volunteer-led organizations that come together in this fellowship to strengthen, to learn, to share, but also to strengthen and build this network. So having this diverse group of folks all doing the work individually as reflective and individuals, Alfredo talked about our own biases, but also together, which is facilitating and driving change and just really disrupting structural racism across the city and the region for themselves, in their own families, also within their organizations and in communities. So it is ongoing work, as you talked about, Shamar, but it's very critical. And we're very proud of the role that we have played to help build capacity of this network of individuals.
Well, you should be proud because this is some phenomenal work that you're doing. Now, you got a bunch of folks listening to you saying, how do I become a fellow? So I got two questions. One, when is the next cohort? And if someone is interested in participating in a cohort, where do they go to get more information? So when's the next cohort and how can people get involved?
Gladly. So we just started our 6th cohort last month. So you all have to wait a while, but I invite you to follow us and engage with us on social media. So the fellowship cohort is 1 year, and it is typically a calendar year. So we won't start our outreach and recruitment for the 7th cohort until the fall. So please visit our website at detroitequity.org. You can also follow us on social media. We're Detroit Equity at Facebook, and then Detroit_equity on Twitter. So look for announcements and recruitment and outreach later this year for our 7th cohort. We'd love to have many of you submit applications and join us.
Thank you so much, Asandi. And you all can check the chat again. There are several links that Steph Willis, thanks Steph, put up, not only about the Damon J. Keith Center, but also more information around the Detroit Equity Action Lab. Now let's turn to Rochelle Riley, the City of Detroit's Director of Arts and Culture and a member of Governor Whitmer's Black Leadership Advisory Council. Good morning, Rochelle. I've already fanned out with you enough today, so I'll keep it professional. So you are recently appointed as a co-chair with fellow panelist, Mr. Robert Womack, to the Governor Whitmer's Black Leadership Advisory Council. Can you tell us about what the work is, what's being done, and why you believe it is so important?
I am thrilled to do that, and I am grateful to be joined on this panel by so many amazing voices to deal with an issue that America and Michigan and every other state has not dealt with, and that's institutional racism that impacts the lives of millions of African Americans. Governor Whitmer took the unprecedented duty to create this advisory body, and literally our job is to recommend policies and possible changes in law designed to eradicate and prevent discrimination and racial inequity in Michigan. It hasn't been done in America, but by God, we're going to give it a shot here in Michigan. And what we're going to do is identify the laws that perpetuate these inequities and make recommendations for them to be changed. We're going to collaborate with the governor and leaders across the state to promote that legislation and regulations to make life better for African Americans. We're going to promote the cultural arts, which I'm excited about, within Black communities through coordinated efforts, advocacy, and collaboration with state government, which I hope will include funding. And we're also going to serve as a resource for community groups because, quite frankly, the state does a lot and has a lot that's going on that a lot of residents don't know about. We're going to be that conduit for that. So I'm so proud that my co-chair, who is on the call as well, and I will join these other leaders. There are 17 of us. And then we also have 4 committees that will make recommendations to the council. And they are studying health, economics, community safety, and education, because those are all the ways that we have to find to make sure that African Americans in Michigan can pursue life, liberty, and happiness.
Oh, well done, well done. Thank you so much.
Sure.
The next question, I know that studying the impact of racism is very important to you. One of the worst aspects of racism is that it harms people, not just as a particular point in time, but over generations. Can you tell us about your book, The Burden, African Americans and the Enduring Impact of Slavery, and the impact that slavery continues to have on African Americans?
Absolutely, and thank you so much for asking. Imagine an America where all of the free labor that would build this great country arrived in 1619, and for centuries was used to take care of the wealth building of white Americans without ever having to pay a dime. And then all of a sudden it's ended, and all of those folks who were not allowed to read because it was illegal, who were not allowed to have jobs because they were discriminated against, were sent away from these plantations saying, you're no longer enslaved, go have at it. And despite that beginning, what African Americans have done in this country, what we have achieved is nothing short of miraculous, but there's never been any recognition of that. Our goal as an American society has been to live in the matrix and pretend like enslavement didn't happen, and to pretend like things are fine when, quite frankly, they haven't been fine. Slavery did not end. It just left the plantation and moved to the courtrooms and newsrooms and boardrooms and classrooms of America. And when I decided to take on this book, I asked people to write essays because I didn't want it to just be me. I wanted to create this chorus of voices to explain it. 23 different essays, some people famous, some people just brilliant. Not one of them was on the same subject. I didn't have to call anybody back when I collected all these essays and say, well, somebody else wrote about justice or somebody else wrote about educate. Every single one was on a different aspect of how enslavement continues to impact how African Americans live. So what we have to do is, number one, stop miseducating children, all children, white, Black, Asian.
Amen.
Because when we do that, what we're doing is perpetuating this myth. That means the history and accomplishments of African Americans, they're not hidden, they've just been totally omitted, which means we are not learning American history, we're not learning American achievement, we're learning just white American achievement. That means white children are being raised generation by generation by generation to believe that white Americans are smarter, better, faster, and worthy of the success that they have, and Black children are not. The impact of that on white children and the impact of that on Black children is something that we have to stop. So this burden that America keeps trying to hide and run from and cannot is something that African Americans have been carrying all this time. And it is time for America to share that burden so that Black folks can put that burden down.
Absolutely. You speak of the burden, and I always tell people it's not like slavery ended and the slaves were able to go to therapy and sort of reconcile what had happened to them for generations, right? And that is it's baked into our DNA.
And I'll tell you one quick thing, and people seem to forget this, but police forces, literally, there wasn't enough crime for there to be the number of police forces we have today. Those folks literally had the jobs of arresting former slaves who did not have the wherewithal to pay bail, just like now. And what would happen is former slave owners would make deals with sheriffs and police chiefs and officers to arrest people when they needed labor, which means a whole lot of folks who were formerly enslaved wound up going back to the plantation because that was in lieu of jail.
I'm gonna let that sit there. And so I know that studying the impact of racism is very important. Oh, excuse me, wrong question. Sorry, everybody.
That's okay.
It was so poignant, I wanted to hear it again. So my second to last question to you, Rochelle, is what can individuals and communities do to help heal from the injuries inflicted by racism? And how do we ensure that organizations are structured to promote healing for people and communities of color?
Well, let me share this paragraph from The Burden. Americans, Black and white, have spent centuries recovering from a system. I'm sorry, that's not the paragraph I wanted. This is more important. There are thousands of examples in written history that detail the physical brutality of slavery. But what America must pay more attention to is the emotional brutality that all boils down to a single post-slavery word that is as much a part of our living and a part of our country as the American flag: permission. Permission to speak, permission to vote, permission to work in jobs that allow us to use all of our talents, permission to drink from community water fountains, permission to dine at public lunch counters, permission to sit anywhere on public buses our tax dollars fund, permission to provide our children with educations equal to those of white peers, permission to embrace the freedom the Emancipation Proclamation lied about, permission to run for the presidency of the United States of America. We African Americans in the United States have spent a century and a half seeking permission, hiding our lights under bushels, accepting less that we deserve because we've been trained to believe we don't deserve more. It's time to put that burden down. Just like alcoholism, if you don't acknowledge there's a problem, you don't get past it. We cannot heal what we don't acknowledge. We cannot do anything about a problem that we try to pretend doesn't exist. So the first thing we have to do is stop carrying that burden and stop seeking permission to be great, to take jobs, to buy houses, to live the way we're supposed to as free Americans. And the second thing we have to do is make sure that we work together to do the first thing. We have to understand that the main thing is to make the main thing the main thing.
And there's a key theme that I'm picking up from our first three panelists, which is acknowledgement, right? We have to be able to say that we got to, as my granddad says, Shamar, you got to call a thing a thing. And you
That's
have to
right.
be able to acknowledge it, right? So fantastic. Ms. Riley, I've got one more question for you. What differences do you see as far as racial equity in the workplace and shifting from the newsroom to working in city government? That's a pretty big jump.
I can tell you that in general, there's absolutely nothing that's different under the sun. You're going to have really, really nice people who are racist. You're going to have really, really hardworking people who think that they got their jobs, whether they're in a newsroom or a classroom or city government conference room, because they're brilliant. And they don't acknowledge that there are all types of things that happened that got them where they are. Without having to have lifted a finger. When we acknowledge, and more people are acknowledging white privilege, when we acknowledge that and start to actually have a level playing field, it will be better. It's interesting for me to have gone from covering city government and writing about everything to now being inside the building. I told somebody, man, I better not write a book when this job is over. I have met some of the hardest working people I've ever met anywhere, but you still have folks who don't understand when they are being not just insensitive, but racist. And I will say this, we have got to get to the point where we recognize that, where we say it's not just acknowledgement, but it's like actually seeing it. So just like Crispus Attucks, an African-American, was the first casualty of the first Revolutionary War, George Floyd was the unwilling and unfortunate victim of the second revolution, and his death has caused so much change, and we have to take advantage of this time period that has happened because of that. Protests around the world, people actually seeing us and hearing us for the first time. That he had to die for that to happen is unfortunate, but everywhere you are, everywhere you go, the only way we stamp out racism is to call a thing a thing. Just like your grandfather said. My grandfather used to say, the older you get, the older you get.
There it is.
If that's all we're going to do, then we just keep going. You have got to step up no matter where you are, no matter who you are, no matter how small you think it is. That's how we end it.
Absolutely. And thank you so much, Rochelle, as we have people from every corner of the state and country represented on this phone call, it doesn't matter what you were taught when you were younger. Rochelle just said, this is an opportunity for you to put your foot down and say, it ends in my family. It ends in my lineage today, right now. And so when you hear a joke at the dinner table amongst family that you know isn't right, now's the time to say something. I know that's your uncle or your aunt or whomever, but when you hear something that you know is not right, think about the Shamars in your organization. Think about the Rochelles and the Asandis and the Roberts that you work with. And would they be laughing at that joke? Would they sit back? complacent or complicit of that story that was told. So this is your opportunity for everybody listening to stand up, and you joining this conversation is if not your first, a number of the steps that you're taking to really change history. So again, thank you.
Thank you so much. I just want to mention one other thing that we have to do. If you are anywhere in the sound of my voice for the next year, we are trying to change this miseducation problem that we're having. My latest book, That They Lived, details the stories of iconic African Americans when they were children. If we start to teach that as a part of American history, we are going to literally wipe out half of the attitudes that have been caused by leaving that history out. So please encourage your school districts to make sure that we do not teach Black history just in February, and that we don't treat amazing and accomplished African Americans like posters to be seen just 1 month out of the year. So thank you for that.
No, thank you. And so we're going to move over to Commissioner Womack. Thank you again for being here, and your co-chair has waxed eloquently. But you as the co-chair of the Governor's Black Leadership Council, I've got just a couple questions for you. And again, good morning, and thank you for joining us. You were chosen by Governor Whitmer to represent Black leadership and public policy as a member of the Black Leadership Advisory Council. Can you tell us about your experience helping minority businesses in West Michigan and how that experience will help you in the work of the Advisory Council?
Yes, thank you very much. And I'm just delighted and so pleased to be here, and very thankful for the invite to be a part of today's great presentation. And I will say I've been a business person for over 20 years and an activist here in West Michigan, particularly in the city of Grand Rapids, Michigan. And also being the father of Black FM radio. When I moved back to Grand Rapids, they were still listening to AM on a daytime radio station that went off at 6 o'clock. And I had a dream and a goal, more specific, to bring in the first FM Black station. I was able to do that. And I faced a lot of racism trying to do that, a lot of red tape, and found out why it took to 2008 for that to happen in the city of Grand Rapids. And one of the things that happened once I started the radio station, the majority of local Black businesses began to contact me for advertising. I saw that they didn't have the lines of credit that they needed to keep their businesses going. I saw that I would have to lower my prices and sometimes give away some free advertisement to help them get the customer base and the societal financial support to keep those businesses going. After I did that, I began to become kind of small-time hero among some of the small businesses for that help. They were so appreciative, but I was also appreciative because I got to stand out of my own interpersonal box, seeing my problems overcoming in the business industry and learn from others of what they were going through. So when you talked about equity at the beginning of this, the one thing I see about equity as opposed to equality is when we're trying to talk about equality, of course, we can treat each other equal and we can fight for that to happen. But when we're talking about living in a country that has already got a chokehold on minority groups, when we historically are not starting off at the same position in a race, because after 400 years of slavery, there are equitable things that were taken away from us, some that can never be returned. The time, 400 years in bondage, how much time did we lose when we were building others' wealth but couldn't build our own wealth? When we were building a country that still to this day doesn't embrace us. So when we talk about equity, now we're looking at the outcomes. Now we have something to judge it by. It's like, you say you're treating us equal, you say you want to see equality and equitable, but when we talk about equity and equitable, we're talking about the outcomes. So one of the things I bring to the Black Leadership Council from a business perspective is to be a voice at a state level for the things that I've been advocating at the local level. We talk about access to funds, but we know there's discriminatory banking practices when it comes to loans and even grants from the current stimulus packages that have left out minority businesses. We talk about the zoning policies where anybody, not only Black, but anybody that's not in the good old boys club here in West Michigan, if your zoning board doesn't allow you to be zoned in, and then somebody that's from a corporation comes in and say, well, we just want to change the zoning laws, and they can come in and become your competition and put you out of business. But you will not always get the favoritism that you need or just treat it equal to have zoning. Redlining that has been fought against in housing has not been exposed in business property, redlining where it also extends. So when they were setting up business district and housing and they wanted to push minorities into one place, there were also places where minorities had money to buy businesses and properties and invest in business areas, and it was like, no, we're not going to allow them. So those are the type of things I want to talk about on a statewide level when it comes to licensing and regulation, the red tape all the way from the new medical marijuana field. Even though I'm not an advocate of any type of drug, whether it's legal, natural, anything that alters the mind state, but at the same time, it's a free country and it's legal and the people are going to participate in it. Why should African Americans continue to be the consumer base that everybody wants? But when it comes to the entrepreneurship, nobody wants them on that side. I want to continue helping them with their workforce resources. I recently, at being on asset committee, which partners with Michigan Works, I recently reached out to Jacob Moss here of Michigan Works here in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and connected him with a minority business that has time after time started restaurants, but is going through a lot of different managers. And I say, if you really want to find a top-notch experienced manager, have you ever reached out to Michigan Works? And they had not been privy to the knowledge. They knew it, but I had to kind of wake that up in their consciousness. And Jacob Moss and Michigan Works, they got in contact with them, sent an email back immediately, and just to see a minority business understand, like in Africa, they have a statement that when they see each other, they don't always say hi, they say, I see you. We've been a visible part of society, but also an invisible part of society. As my co-chair eloquently explained, with African Americans feeling we have to ask permission. That meant they've also filtered out some of our most brightest artwork. They filtered out some of our most brightest entrepreneurs that aren't welcome out to some of the award shows when they're showing the young people who are doing the great things in the community. You seldom get a chance to see, and that goes all the way down to our youth. If they don't see the successful African Americans that came out of the same living conditions and proved there's no excuses for failure, even though we fight racism every day, even though we fight inequality every day, even though we fight inequity every day, we have the tools amongst ourselves to overcome anything, but they are not seen, they are not highlighted. So at the state, to make this a little shorter, I could go on all day on some of the things I do for businesses, but I just want to highlight a lot of those things when it comes to business at a state level, so we can have more African American and minority businesses sprouting here in the state of Michigan. Thank you.
Commissioner, we thank you for your work. I want to do a quick process check with some of the folks who may be having a little bit of angst or anxiety, or you're feeling a certain way or about some of the things that you've heard our panelists discuss. I encourage you to lean into that feeling. I encourage you to sit down and ask yourself, why do I feel this way? Why am I being triggered by some of the words that I am hearing? Because if this is your first time hearing a discussion like this, it can be heavy, but I want to acknowledge the fact that you're here, you're listening, and I am hoping that you're trying to learn and overcome, whether it's privilege, whether it's a misunderstanding, or just a lack of knowledge that you have. I want to thank you for being here. But if you are feeling uncomfortable, that's a good thing. That means you are acknowledging something deep down inside of you. And so, Commissioner, I have one additional question for you, and then we're going to open it up for some panel discussion. To the folks that are hitting me in the chat, asking me about specific questions to ask, we do have some scripted questions, and if we have time at the end, we will try and get to some of your questions in the chat, but our panelists as well as myself are prepared to answer some specific questions, and we're going to be open if we have time to opening it up to the field per se. So, Commissioner Womack, one of the terrible acts of racial violence that we all have at the forefront of our minds is the death of Brianna Taylor, who is from Grand Rapids, Michigan. She was killed when police entered her apartment in Louisville, Kentucky on a no-knock warrant. Her mother, Tamika, will be talking with the advisory council she talked to the council, on February 25th about the possibility of the ban on no-knock warrants and having it be named after her daughter, Brianna Taylor, as the Brianna Taylor Law. Can you tell us more about the proposed Brianna Taylor Law?
Yes, and for those who may not know, Brianna Taylor was killed on March 21st, 2020 in Louisville by police who were serving a no-knock warrant for an ex-boyfriend of hers that she was no longer involved with. It was done in the middle of the night. Police say that they announced themselves. The only living survivor in the house, in Brianna Taylor's house or apartment, was actually her boyfriend, who thought intruders were invading to rob him. He did not hear a knock. He did not hear anyone state they were the police. He saw people entering his house with guns, and he fired off a warning shot. That warning shot did hit a police officer. The police returned 32 bullets. 6 of those bullets hit Brianna Taylor, who was an emergency medical technician at the University of Louisville Health at that time, and she was killed. One of the things about Brianna Taylor's death, as we talk about George Floyd's death, and now it has reignited a revolution for justice, Brianna Taylor being a female, and sometimes even within our own race, there's divisions, whether it's divisions based upon light-skinned, dark-skinned, rich, poor, classism, nepotism, where you're not my blood family, or female versus male. Brianna Taylor's death, so close to the death of George Floyd, unites us and shows us, hey, what do they have in common? They try to say George Floyd had a criminal record. So you have some people in their interpersonalized racism that use that for justification for a man to have someone put their knee on his neck for 9 minutes, and a person's last words being, "I can't breathe." You have people interpersonally who believe Black males are threats. So now we have a female. What do they have in common? They are both Black, and both of their lives are being looked as if they're unimportant, that they're unworthy of life. She is a medical technician. She is a female. She is someone that doesn't have a criminal record. She is someone that was not under investigation for a crime. So to get quickly to the Brianna Taylor Law, which is going to help everyone in America, they want to outlaw no-knock warrants, number one. But also during the Brianna Taylor shooting, police who were wearing body cams did not have those body cams on, and there would be no discussion on whether they announced who they were or not if they had simply had their body cams on. So part of Brianna Taylor's law is also they want officers to wear their body cams during all home entries and raids, that this has to be something that is mandated. And I'm looking to try to push, I begin conversations to try to push this mandate to be federally. Now that we have an administration in office that owes a lot of their success of becoming the executive leaders of this country to African Americans and minorities in a big tiebreaker on an election. So I was very happy that Governor Whitmer allowed someone from the East, my co-chair Riley, to come to be a chair of this board, and myself to come be the co-chair and a chair of this board, because I got a chance to bring Tamika Palmer, Brianna Taylor's mother, who's from my hometown, Grand Rapids, Michigan, to the Black Leadership Advisory Council, introduce her to Governor Gilchrist. The family was so happy because they were going through so much red tape trying to contact anybody with the state. I let them know the state is, it is a lot of red tape no matter who you are, trying to get to the governor. But that's just the foresight of our governor to put the Black Leadership Advisory Council together. And for one of our first meetings together to have something as historical as the Breonna Taylor case and the Breonna Taylor law come before us and do something constructive to move that along. The protest for Breonna Taylor has been a worldwide protest.
Thank you so much, Commissioner. We appreciate the insight and the backstory for those who may not know the horrible events that happened to Breonna Taylor. And you have to understand, there's a ripple effect. We didn't just have a young lady lose her life. We had a mother lose a daughter. We had people's friends lose a friend, right? I did not know that woman, but I felt it in my heart the minute I read that story. So this is something that was of a reverberating effect. So Commissioner, thank you for the backstory and insight. We're going to open up some questions to the entire panel now. And we have about 6 to get through, but I am mindful of time, as I know we all are scheduled to go to 12:30. So we're going to push you right up until the 12:29 mark because I believe in ending our meetings on time. So if we can't get to all of the questions, we're going to try our best. So to the panel, over the course of the past year, we have seen so much racially based violence and hate in our society. Racism is very much still alive across our country. What can we do to shed more light on what empowers hatred, the structures that perpetuate division, and the consequences of fear and intimidation? So I don't have a perfect way of folks speaking, so you worm your way in there as best you can.
Well,
Tamara,
I'm happy to, go ahead, Sandy.
Thank you, Rochelle. I just want to quickly share a couple of thoughts that come to mind. One of which Rochelle already mentioned about the miseducation. And so I think about that related to our young people, but also adults. And so there's an abundance of ignorance about the history of this country and the contributions that Black and Brown folks have made to create this America that we live in today. I think also it is important to have, while we talked about acknowledging harm, but it is important to acknowledge that hate is really rooted in fear, and the fear of the unknown, as well as the fear of quote unquote othering, those people. And I think considering the practice of listening to understand, not listening to change folks' minds, may help us to really kind of learn, share, but possibly even foster some connections.
And some of that ignorance, Asandi, is willful, right? Like if I stick my head in the sand and just say that didn't happen, I get to sleep better at night because I'm willfully not acknowledging it. Rochelle, go right ahead.
I just wanted to quickly say that, while America was sleeping, this hatefulness grew, particularly over the past 4 years. So the most important way to make sure that we don't lose this moment and let this opportunity to change how we live go away is to seize the moment. You know, Gil Scott-Heron said the revolution will not be televised, but it is being televised. And every chance that we have to speak out and continue this moment and this movement and this opportunity to make sure that people do not walk away from this. We have come close many times. Every time we've come close, a leader was killed like Dr. Martin Luther King, or we lost interest because of something else. We have to make sure we do not let this moment go. We have to deal with white privilege. We have to deal with the hatefulness. We have to deal with the fact that this country was founded on white supremacy. That's not a negative word, that is a fact. We're talking about a bunch of men in white wigs who owned slaves who founded America. They did not really found it in 1776. It was founded in 1619 when the free labor arrived, but they ratified it in 1776 and wrote a fake document that said all men are created equal. And we have lived with that fakeness all this time. We have got to stop. And as your grandfather so wisely said, call a thing a thing.
Amen. Commissioner Womack or Alfredo, either one of you want?
Yes, and I'd like to also say they look at the year 1619 being the first year that African-American slaves were brought across the transatlantic ocean over here through the Middle Passage, 1619. Also in the 1600s, you begin to see in the literature of Europeans the word race and defining people by race and policies and laws on how people of a different race will be treated. So we need 100% of America to understand that racism exists. I find myself in many debates with people in West Michigan that say racism either doesn't exist, never exists, or some who feel that they are more liberal than most, that it doesn't exist anymore today, or it doesn't exist so much today. It's like racism exists. That is the first thing we have to establish. And what are you going to do to help eliminate racism? And part of that question also talks about how fear and intimidation, how it affects this country. You look at Obama, and they call the Affordable Health Care Act the Obama Act. And just think, having our first African-American president and his administration bringing something that would help everybody, but there were still people who didn't want to embrace it because he was an African-American, or because some people would say of a different party, but mostly being an African-American and the birther movement saying Obama wasn't born in America, and as if our American government structure would allow someone to be elected president without checking their birth certificate or not. So you get a chance to see on a national level of what African Americans face in their work under the managerial racism. What Obama is national, we all see it. Everybody sees it. It's national, it was on TV, but what about the one Black person? Or 2 or 3 Black people that work in a corporation with 300 white people, and 1 or 2 of them get brave enough to talk about the racism, the policies, the things that's holding them back, and the future minorities that may come through the company. We protect whistleblowers, but we do not protect whistleblowers once that word racism comes up. You're called the aggressive Black female or the aggressive Black male. People may stop calling you. The internalized racism amongst ourselves, other Blacks may move away from you. So I just wanted to put out, number one, we have to know racism exists, what we are going to do about it. And everybody watching in a workplace with influence, definitely do what you can to stop the managerial racism, because it hurts your company. It hurts our world. We might have found the cure for cancer by now, that we've been working together as the human race, instead of partaking in racism and holding others back from being able to contribute on what we all need to survive in this global world economy and health crisis that we are facing, not only with COVID-19, but other health-related crises. Thank you.
Thank you. Alfredo, did you want to jump in?
Sure, just to add to everything that's been said, I think we need to also critically think about the strategies to dismantle racism and to recognize that that it requires intentional strategy to be able to do so. So, for example, if we were to go back in time 200 or 300 years ago and ask folks back then who were in support of slavery and all of it, what did it feel like to be evil? More than likely, those folks would struggle with the question and would not see themselves as evil. Now, there's no exception to us in the present in relation to the evils that exist in the world. No one says, here we are, we're the evil people, and over there are the good people. So there's evilness in the world, yet none of us really holds on to it. It exists somewhere else. So as we think about the progress that we've seen, we could think, in the late 19th century, abolishment of slavery. Well, did that mean now that folks were free and that society was just and equitable? Absolutely not. We had Jim Crow laws that extended for about a century. Now we have civil rights movement in the 60s that prohibit discrimination, et cetera. Does that mean then that we were a society where everything was great and things were just moving right along equity lines? Absolutely not. So, and we could look at ourselves today and we could look at ourselves in the future, but we could look at ourselves today and say, mountaintop, here we are. Diversity is everywhere, and we have achieved it. So what are we talking about when we talk about racism? And the fact is that 100 years from now, just in the same ways that we can look at the past and acknowledge that there was tons of work to be done, folks 100 years from now are going to look at us and say, what were they doing? How were they not able to see the systemic conditions that were generating inequities based on class, gender, sexual orientation, et cetera. So I think that the work requires that we help folks understand some of the things that they're not able to understand. And yes, there's absolutely tons of explicit racism, but that is not the main problem. The main problem is the unconscious bias that is shaping folks in ways in which they don't know about. So we need tons of education. But one of the great things that is happening as we see great momentum at the state level, I think the state of Michigan, the governor's office is doing incredible stuff to acknowledge racism as a public health crisis, to not hide it, to not pretend that it's not real, is that we take that momentum and we combine it with the peer pressure that comes with it and with education. I think we're living in very promising times. But what we need to remember, we have made progress, but let's just not hold on to that progress for too long and feel too secure with it because we're by no means there. We have not reached the mountaintop and we have tons of work to be done. So hold on to the progress for just a little bit and get busy to work.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I love it. Like, this work is not done. We're nowhere near done with it. And so as long as we center ourselves in the fact that there's a lot more to do, we're going to be okay. The deep racial and ethnic inequities that exist today are a direct result of structural racism. Structural racism continues to disproportionately segregate communities of color from access to opportunity and upward mobility by making it more difficult for people of color to secure quality education, jobs, housing, healthcare. And so there was a question around COVID and healthcare inequity, so maybe we can bake that in, and equal treatment in the criminal justice system. What steps can we take to address these inequities? So maybe I'll read that again because I jumped in there a little bit, but the deep racial and ethnic inequities that exist today are direct results of structural racism. Structural racism continues to disproportionately segregate communities of color from access to opportunities and upward mobility by making it more difficult for people of color to secure quality education, jobs, housing, healthcare, and equal treatment in the criminal justice system. What steps can we take to address those inequities?
I'll take a shot at it, Shamar, very briefly. We're talking structural racism, which means you have to knock down the structures. Do not elect people who are racist. Do not patronize companies that embrace racism or refuse to refute it. And if you are part of either a part of government or part of keeping government honest, you have to make sure that there are not governmental structures that are put in place. For instance, having people to sit in jail awaiting trials where they're proved to be innocent, but they couldn't get out because they couldn't afford the bail. And the most important thing is to stop pretending that we have equitable education of Black and white children in America, in Michigan, in all of our cities. We do not. And as long as we pretend that schools are equal and that we're educating kids the same way, we will always have the same wealth gaps, the same education gaps, the same inability to achieve equally, and we will never get rid of structural racism. So you knock down the structure, you knock down structural racism.
So you're telling me a Black kid just doesn't need to work harder in school. There's some systems that are there that are prohibiting that.
I am so sick of people saying, if you just, give them an extra book when they didn't have a book in the first place, or tell them to stay at school longer if they're in a building in winter with no heat. We're talking equitable, which means you're going to have to provide more money for students who either have been without or who are in systems that have been without, so that they are starting at the same place as students in districts where, because of property taxes, they have twice the resources, twice the teachers, twice the opportunity. So no, it's not just about working harder, although our kids work so hard. It's about being equitable.
Thank you. And Commissioner Womack, I see you're not muted.
Yes, I would say when we look at the structural racism and understand that it's interwoven in the fabric of America, the USA, United States of America, all the way from our Constitution. When you look at the 3/5 human being, this was supposed to be a compromise. So it was actually decided at the Supreme Court we could be 3/5 a human being. Later in the Supreme Court, we have the situation with the Dred Scott case where Justice Tanner said there is no right of a Black person that any white man is obligated to honor, and that the forefathers of this country believed that Blacks should be subject to only being the benefit of white people, which gives them the right to reduce them to slavery. These are Supreme Court decisions. We have the 13th Amendment, no one would be a slave as long as they don't have a felony. Now we have a privatized prison system that they make money by sending people to prison. You have prosecutors that catch a person, instead of charging them with the one obvious felon that they may think they caused, will charge them with multiple felonies, knowing that 3 strikes and we can keep you for 20 years. So you have the 3 strikes law. You have presidents who have run on the fear factor of crime and the war on drugs, which really was a war on African Americans. There was participation in the drug level from every race, from all races, from government officials who were part of it, from the CIA who brought drugs and guns into LA, to not only to destabilize the Black community, but for the Iran-Contra scandal where they were using that money to buy guns. And this is all recorded facts. So if anyone's hearing this and saying, hey, that's kind of hurting my feelings, you would accuse my government of this, you can look this up, that these things have happened. So as Rochelle said, we have to break down these structures. We have to rebuild them for the new world that we're looking for. If we get in a car accident today and we go to our insurance company, if the frame is broke, they tell us we're going to scrap the car. We're not going to fix it. We're going to scrap that. You're going to have to get a new car. So, and most of the people that are outwardly racist, and I would tell people that sometimes I'm happy to see that the people who are outwardly racist admit it. It gives us a better way to study. But they're always talking about holding on to the old traditions, the old way of life, the way things used to be. So they're anti-advancement, and it's time for people to look in, some of the people who don't admit it even to themselves, that they partake in a racist structure, racist policies that they need to stand up for. And we need to stand together, united, Black, white, people, all colors and ethnic groups, stand up, stop being afraid. When we talk about the fear intimidation, not only with the lynchings of African Americans and things they've done to instill fear into our communities, they've also instilled fear within the white race, that when you do find those who do know that racism exists, they're also become a minority, not a minority in our state, but in the state of mind of being white, and the few lone voices that want to say this is wrong. And I see so many white people that'll tell me behind the scenes of the racism they see, but when they see us out there on the struggle, not saying protesting, okay, come and protest, but when you're actually on a board, you're on a committee, you're a judge, you're somebody in a place of power. And 99% of the white activists I know, when it comes to a chance to lose their job, they buckle. They buckle. So how can we ever change racism if everybody can't overcome the fear and stand up once and for all? And as my co-chair said, be the generation to eliminate this shame upon America that continues.
Sandy?
A few steps that I would like to offer are to really refute this notion of lack, that there is not enough for everybody. I think that that is one of the steps that we can take. I think part of racism feeds that I cannot allow you to have or share or give, because then it will equate with less for me and mine, which is not true. Also, racism harms everybody. Someone else, one of the fellow panelists talked about that, but I think that white folks don't understand that, or maybe don't see that, but it's not just harming me and people who look like me, it's harming you, whether you know it or not. There also is this opportunity for us to explore co-liberation, which is part of the work that we do with DEAL. And so, Robert, you talked about the white folks and folks who are protesting, but there are ways that we can really build together to collectively address the inequities that we see. And finally, something that Rochelle talked about in terms of, again, going back to what's very important about education, is the spatial racism part of it, about like where we live and how that impacts what we have access to and resources to. So spatial racism and looking at the property, the tax dollars and the income is very, very real, particularly in the city of Detroit. And so that can't be ignored as something that is a factor that influences our young people, future generations, and adults right now that are working and living in the city of Detroit.
Shamar, I do want to mention one other thing, because I don't want this to end before we say this. We have to be really careful about the use of the word they, because the we and the they is not black and white. The we and the they is those who want this to end and achieve that dream of America that was always there, and the folks who don't. Because I have plenty of white colleagues, allies, folks who are about this, and they always have been there, co-founding the NAACP, working in the civil rights movement. We have got to make sure that we don't paint with that broad brush, because what we want to do is to make sure that we're willing to accept the help and work together. I just want to make sure to say that, because I have so many friends who are working so hard with me, and we have to make sure that if we can get everybody on the side of right, regardless of color, against the folks who are wrong, we can make some progress.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, Alfredo, I'd love to hear from you.
Just briefly, I think we need to acknowledge the resistance has been here. It was here in the past, and it will be here tomorrow. So we need to be strategic in the ways in which we will minimize the resistance. And part of that is through education, as it was just mentioned. It's not about us and them. And the work is about increasing racial consciousness and cultural competency, so that new awareness leads the change. Everything that we have done so far, we haven't ever dismantled structural racism. But one thing that we can do is to make DEI a priority. We could see a lot of that already taking place at the state level, so that we begin to operationalize it in ways that are institutionalized, but that are also driven by a new racial consciousness and awareness that helps us understand things that today we still don't understand. We want folks to get to acknowledgement, or we want folks to get to acknowledgement in ways that has depth, so that the work can drive and move forward. We're not there yet. So education to prevent to minimize the resistance, I think it's also a key component to dismantling structural racism.
Fantastic. I'm going to make an executive decision here, and they can dock my pay for doing so. But what I'd like to do is give each of our panelists about 30 to 45 seconds to give us some words that we can take with us and think about moving into the weekend. And so, Alfredo, I'd like to start with you, and then I'm just going to work across the screen. In my screen, it goes Alfredo, Robert, Asandi, Rochelle. And so if you could just prepare your mind for about 35, 45 seconds worth of comment. Alfredo, what is something you want to leave our listeners and attendees with?
Sure. I believe that we all have a social responsibility to dismantle the isms that exist in our society today. Part of that requires that we acknowledge each one of us is a part of the problem. So I think that we need to make sure that we reflect and step into a place of introspection where we recognize what are those biases that are impacting us in ways that we're completely unaware of, and how can we begin to embrace and empower sense of responsibility that move us away from that blame and that shame, so that we get out of the way of ourselves and embrace the work, so we're no longer anymore entertaining this notion or the question as to whether or not racism is still a thing. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Womack.
Yes, I want to thank everybody that's a part of this panel, all the staff that put this great presentation together, invited us. I definitely want to, number one, thank God for all us being here today as his children. And number two, I want to thank so significantly everybody that took time off your schedule to view and tune into this today. Because if you're tuning into this, you are part of the solution, because you care enough to seek the information on what is happening and what you can do to bring change. So I want to thank you. I also want to say, if you didn't feel shocked, if you didn't feel like your feelings were hurt, if you didn't feel like, if you're patriotic to this country and you can hear the history of this country and sometimes you don't feel offended, then I haven't been effective, because I cannot be effective without telling the truth. And we know the word flirt, we know the word flattery. We were all high school students once with love interests or friends we wanted to have. And we know I tell people what they want to hear, but I have to put my want for change in front of my want to appease you. I like to see you happy because I want to see us happy. I want to see us all happy. But there's no way we can get to true change on racism without going over some of the horrific things that have happened in the past. And we know there's things that have happened to a lot of other people besides Black people. We see the Holocaust. None of that is hid because it happened on a foreign soil. But when we talk about the Black Holocaust here in the United States of America, the millions we lost in the Middle Passage, people feel uneasy. But we have to go there for you to truly understand the effects of slavery, the effects of racism, continued racism, and how detrimental and painful it is to a people. So with that said, I still thank everyone that tuned in and listened today and want to be a part of the change. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Sandy?
If your organization issued a statement last year in response to George Floyd and Brianna Taylor's murders, I want you to revisit that statement. I want to challenge you to do that. And I want you to ask yourself tough questions. And I want to charge you with doing more. I don't know what you're doing, but I want to challenge you to do more.
I love it. Fantastic. Challenge accepted at Michigan Works Southeast. Thank you, Asandi. Rochelle, you want to bring us home?
Thank you. Douglas Blackman, in his seminal masterpiece, Slavery by Another Name, wrote, African Americans were portrayed by most historians as an almost static component of US society. Their leaders changed with each generation, but the mass of Black Americans were depicted as if the freed slaves of 1863 were the same people still not free 50 years later. There was no acknowledgement of the effects of cycle upon cycle of malevolent defeat, of the injury of seeing one generation rise above the cusp of poverty only to be indignantly crushed. And unlike the victims of the Jewish Holocaust, who were on the whole literate, comparatively wealthy, and positioned to record for history the horror that enveloped them, Black Americans had virtually no capacity to preserve their memories or document their destruction. For the vast majority, no recordings, writings, images, or physical descriptions survived. No capacity to preserve their memories or document their destruction. Lord, our lost history. As we continue to remember that every Black child in America is born fighting and born having to be hit in the face at some point with the reality that we have been living with a myth, I want you to think about those children. I want their faces to be what you see to fuel us to work together for change. Thank you to Michigan Works. Thank you to Shamar for excellent questions. Thank you to my fellow panelists for being so great, to my co-chair. We've got a lot of good work coming. But thank you again to all of you for being here, because it means you really do care. And I'm so glad to see so many faces. Thank you.
Absolutely. My sentiments of thanks go out to everyone, especially our esteemed and just phenomenal panelists. Thank you so much for sharing with us. Thank you to the association for pulling this together in such a meaningful and thoughtful way. And equally as important, thank you to all of the attendees. You all have been phenomenal throughout this. And so the Michigan Works Association staff and leadership will be continuing their work on diversity, equity, and inclusion with their series of panel discussions through the year on this topic. The next panel discussion will take place in May and will focus on disability. Be on the lookout for more details coming soon. Have a great day. Enjoy the sun. And remember, we must be kind to one another. Take care and have a great day.